The city never really slept, but it changed after midnight. The streets got quieter, lonelier. I knew them too well, every shortcut, every alley where the streetlights flickered and the trash piled up. I had been driving these roads for years, trying to outrun my debts, my exhaustion, and the silence waiting for me at home. Lily was probably asleep by now. 9 years old, still curling up in bed with the stuffed rabbit her mother gave her. I used to sit with her until she drifted off, but that was before the bills started stacking up, before I had to take on every night shift I could. She didn't complain, but I could see it in her eyes when I left, how much she hated it. How much I hated it too. The taxi's screen lit up. A new request. Jonathan. Crescent Hotel. A place where the cheapest room cost more than I made in a month. I had no business being there, but the fare looked good, and I couldn't afford to be picky. When I pulled up, I barely had time to stop before the passenger slid into the back seat. No hesitation, no small talk. He was well-dressed but not flashy, leather jacket, dark jeans, expensive boots. Not a businessman, not a drunk rich kid. Something about him felt tough. Where to? I asked, adjusting the rearview mirror. He looked at me through the reflection, his expression sharp. Just drive? That set off alarms in my head. I'd had my fair share of sketchy fares, and this guy had the same energy. People who wanted to just drive usually had a damn good reason. I need a destination, I said. East Side, he muttered. I'll tell you when to stop. I hesitated. My gut told me to cancel the ride, but my wallet didn't have the luxury. I pulled away from the hotel, watching him in the mirror. He kept glancing over his shoulder, checking the street behind us. You in trouble? I asked. No. Liar. I didn't push. I just drove, weaving through the empty streets. The guy kept shifting in his seat, tapping his fingers against his knee. He had money, I could tell, but he wasn't acting like someone who felt safe. At a red light, I glanced at him again. You sure you don't want to tell me what's going on? He exhaled sharply. Look man, just do your job. I bit back a reply. Fine. Not my business. But then I noticed the headlights behind us. A black SUV. Keeping its distance, but there. I turned left. So did the SUV. I turned right. So did the SUV. Jonathan must have noticed too, because he cursed under his breath. Lose them, he said. I laughed. Lose them? You think this is a damn movie? I drive a 20-year-old taxi, not a getaway car. His hand dipped into his jacket, and for a second, I thought he was reaching for a gun. But instead he pulled out a thick roll of cash. Do it, he said, voice low. I'll make it worth your while. I could smell trouble on him, but I could also see the money. I had a kid to feed. I made my choice. I hit the gas. The taxi lurched forward, tires screeching as I swerved through an intersection. The SUV sped up, closing the gap. Jonathan twisted in his seat. Faster. Buddy, this isn't a sports car. The SUV was gaining. I turned down a narrow street, barely squeezing through before cutting hard into another turn. The taxi skidded, but I kept control. Shit, Jonathan muttered. I checked the mirror. The SUV had to slow down. Too big for these tight roads. Where the hell do you want me to take you? I demanded. Jonathan didn't answer right away. His jaw clenched. Just keep going. We need to get out of here. I turned onto a main road, heading toward the industrial district. Fewer cars, fewer people. The SUV was still behind us, but farther now. Who are they? I asked. Jonathan shook his head. You don't want to know. He was right. I didn't. But I was in it now. I took a sudden left, then another, darting into an underpass and killing the headlights. The taxi rolled to a stop behind an abandoned building. I killed the engine. Silence. The SUV sped past, not seeing us. Jonathan let out a breath. Smart. I turned to face him. Now tell me what the hell I just got myself into. He hesitated, then peeled off a few $100 bills and tossed them into the front seat. For the trouble? I didn't touch the money. I don't like games, man. You sit in my cab, you put me in danger, and you expect me to be fine with it? Jonathan leaned forward. Look, you did me a favor. You don't need to know the details. I stared at him. You realize if they find you, they'll find me too? They won't, he said. Just drive me to the train station. That's all you gotta do. I gritted my teeth, then restarted the engine. I should have told him to get the hell out of my car. I should have driven straight to the cops. But I didn't. Because when you're desperate, you make bad choices. And something told me this was one of them. The rain made everything look colder, meaner. It drummed against the windshield in a steady rhythm, turning the city lights into a blur of gold and red. I was already tired, already on edge from the mess with the SUV, but I needed the money. I needed to get home to Lily. One more ride. Just one. I pulled up to the address on the screen. The man waiting there didn't fit the name I was expecting. Jonathan. Not the same Jonathan who nearly got me killed earlier. This Jonathan was old, thin, hunched over, his frame swallowed by a heavy coat that had seen better days. He clutched a leather journal, the kind that looked older than both of us put together, his fingers wrapped around it like it was the only thing keeping him upright. He didn't speak. Just opened the door, slid into the back seat, and handed me a crumpled piece of paper. An address. No words, no explanation. Just silence. I started driving. The rain made the roads slick, each turn a careful calculation. In the mirror, I kept an eye on him. He wasn't just quiet, he was somewhere else entirely. His fingers traced the spine of that old journal, slow and careful, like a habit formed over decades. His other hand trembled slightly as he turned the pages. I caught glimpses in the mirror, sketches, handwriting, old photographs. And then I saw her. A woman's face, sketched in fine detail. The lines soft, but the shading was deep, like whoever drew it had stared at her for a long time, memorizing every shadow and curve. Her eyes seemed alive, full of something I couldn't name. A tear slipped down Jonathan's cheek. I didn't ask. I'd been doing this long enough to know when a man carried something too heavy to share. But then we stopped at a red light. The silence sat between us like a third passenger, thick and suffocating. Beautiful drawing, I said, my voice low. Jonathan blinked, like he'd forgotten where he was. His grip on the journal tightened. She was, he murmured. His voice was rough, cracked like old pavement. I waited, but he didn't say more. We kept driving. The city changed as we moved. The bright lights of downtown gave way to dimly lit streets, old brick buildings covered in graffiti. I'd been here before. The kind of neighborhood where my fares usually kept their heads down, where you learned quick that eye contact could be taken the wrong way. I glanced at Jonathan again. His clothes were neat but worn. His shoes were good quality but scuffed. He wasn't homeless, but he wasn't far from it. "What's at this address?" I asked. For a long moment, he didn't answer. Then, in a voice almost too soft to hear over the rain, he said, "Memories." I let that sit. Then, from the corner of my eye, I noticed a shadow moving on the sidewalk. A figure, hood up, watching the taxi as we passed. I turned the corner and saw another. Then another. We weren't alone. I gripped the wheel tighter. "You sure this is where you need to be?" Jonathan sighed, closing the journal. "It's where I was meant to end up." I didn't like that answer. A group of guys stood at the next intersection, leaning against a boarded-up shop. Their clothes were too clean for street kids. Their eyes tracked the taxi. I knew their type. The ones who thought a man like me didn't belong here, like I was polluting their streets just by existing. I'd dealt with it before. Being a brown man in a white man's city meant knowing when to look down, when to keep your mouth shut, when to move on before someone reminded you whose streets these really were. Jonathan shifted in his seat. "You can let me out here?" I hesitated. "You sure?" He nodded, already reaching for the door handle. I pulled over. He stepped out, the rain hitting his shoulders immediately. That's when I saw them move. 3 of them. Crossing the street fast. Not running, but with a purpose. Jonathan saw them too. He froze, gripping his journal. I shouldn't have cared. Should have just driven away. But something about him, about the way he stood there, waiting for whatever was coming, made me put the car in park. The tallest of the 3 stepped forward. He was young, built like a man who had never worked a real job in his life. His friends flanked him, their grins sharp, their hands resting in their pockets like they had something to prove. "Late night for an old man," the tall one said, voice lazy. "Lost?" Jonathan said nothing. One of the others smirked. Maybe he's got something worth sharing. His eyes flicked to the journal. I exhaled slowly. I'd seen this play out too many times before. They weren't here for money. They were here for fun. Jonathan didn't move. Didn't argue. Just held that journal tighter, like that woman on the page was the only thing keeping him standing. I tightened my grip on the wheel. One of them reached out, fast, snatching the journal from Jonathan's hands. Jonathan let out a strangled noise, something between a gasp and a cry. His hands clawed at the air, desperate, but the taller one shoved him back. He stumbled, hit the ground hard. Laughter. The leader flipped through the pages, his smirk growing wider. What's this? Your little diary? Jonathan struggled to sit up, his breath ragged. Please, his voice broke. The leader's smirk faded. Please? He stepped forward, crouching down. What's a man like you got to beg for? I clenched my jaw. I'd seen enough. I threw the car into reverse, hitting the gas just enough to make the tires screech. The sound snapped their heads toward me. The leader straightened. Mind your business, driver. I threw the car into park, stepping out into the rain. He's my fare. One of them laughed. He ain't anymore. I held his gaze. Didn't look away. Didn't back down. The leader scoffed, tossing the journal onto the ground, letting the pages soak in the rain. Ain't worth shit anyway. They walked away. I moved fast, helping Jonathan up. His hands shook as he reached for the journal, his fingers running over the ruined pages. I didn't say anything. He turned to me, rain running down his face, mixing with the tears. Why did you help? I didn't have an answer. Get in, I muttered. He did. I pulled away from the curb, leaving the past behind us. I pulled up to the address, a crumbling apartment complex with broken windows and a flickering streetlight barely holding on. The kind of place that felt forgotten, swallowed by the city's indifference. The rain had turned to a soft drizzle, soaking the cracked pavement and pooling in potholes. Jonathan sat still for a moment, his fingers clenching around the journal like he was afraid to let go. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he reached into his coat and pulled out a few crumpled bills. His hands trembled as he handed them to me. Thank you, he murmured, voice barely above a whisper. I took the money without counting. It felt wrong, like taking from a man who had nothing left to give. Jonathan stepped out of the taxi, his frail body swallowed by the night. He walked toward the entrance of the building, his steps unsteady. No hesitation. No looking back. He disappeared into the shadows, and just like that, he was gone. I let out a breath, rolling my shoulders to shake off the weight of the ride. My shift wasn't over. There were still bills to pay, still another few hours before I could go home. I reached for my phone to check for another ride, but as I glanced at the back seat, I froze. The journal. It lay there, soaked in the faint glow of the dashboard lights. Jonathan must have forgotten it. For a second, I thought about leaving it there. Not my business. Just another stranger, another ride. But something in my gut wouldn't let it go. I picked it up. The leather was old, cracked, worn from years of handling. My fingers hesitated on the cover before I flipped it open. The pages were filled with sketches. Some rough, some detailed, but always of the same woman. The lines of her face changed, sometimes young and bright-eyed, sometimes older, with deep shadows beneath her eyes. But she was always there, staring back at me from the paper like she had a story to tell. I turned the pages, my breath growing heavier. Love letters, written in elegant but shaky handwriting. Descriptions of stolen moments, of whispered promises, of nights spent under the stars. Then the dates started to skip. Gaps between entries grew wider. The handwriting became messier, the words losing their careful structure. And then I saw the last page. Tomorrow it ends. There's nothing left for me. A chill crawled up my spine. I snapped the book shut, my heartbeat pounding against my ribs. Jonathan wasn't just some old man clinging to memories. He had come here to die. I cursed under my breath, shoving the journal onto the passenger seat. I shouldn't care. Should just drive away, pretend I never saw it. People gave up all the time in this city. But something about him, about the way he looked at that journal like it was the only thing keeping him alive, made it impossible to ignore. I put the car in park and stepped out. The drizzle soaked into my jacket instantly, but I didn't care. I hurried toward the entrance Jonathan had disappeared through, my boots splashing through puddles. The building smelled of damp wood and cigarettes, the walls covered in peeling paint and graffiti. I hesitated at the door. What the hell was I even going to say? Hey, old man, you left your journal, and by the way, are you planning on offing yourself tonight? I shook my head. No choice now. The buzzer panel was ancient, half the buttons missing. I pressed the only one that wasn't rusted over and waited. Nothing. I hit it again. Still nothing. A door inside the building creaked open, and I caught a glimpse of a man stepping into the dim hallway. He was white mid-30s, with greasy blonde hair slicked back and a cigarette hanging from his lips. His eyes locked onto me immediately, narrowing. You lost cabbie? His voice was sharp, like he'd been looking for a fight all day. Looking for Jonathan, I said, keeping my tone neutral. The guy smirked. Old man? What, he owe you money or something? I didn't answer. He took a slow drag of his cigarette, exhaling through his nose like a goddamn dragon. He don't talk much. Barely comes out of his room. Probably dead already. Something about the way he said it made my skin crawl. You know which apartment? I asked. The guy chuckled, shaking his head. Yeah, sure, I'll just help the brown cabbie play hero. What's next, you gonna ask me for a job? I clenched my jaw. I'd heard worse. This city wasn't built for people like me. But I didn't have time for this shit. Which apartment? I repeated, my voice harder. He held up his hands in mock surrender. All right. 3rd floor, end of the hall. But hey, don't expect a warm welcome. I turned away before I did something stupid. The stairs groaned under my weight as I climbed, the air thick with the smell of mildew. My pulse pounded with every step. 3rd floor. The hallway was narrow, dimly lit by a single flickering bulb. Jonathan's door was at the very end. It was closed, silent. I knocked. No answer. I knocked harder. Still nothing. A sick feeling curled in my gut. Jonathan. I called out, pounding on the door. Nothing. I tried the handle. But I took a step back, my breath coming fast. I didn't have time to wait. I lifted my foot and kicked. The old wood cracked under the impact. A second kick, and the door swung open, slamming against the wall. The room was dark. A single lamp cast a dim glow over a tiny, cluttered space. Papers were scattered across the floor. The air was thick, heavy. Then I saw him. Jonathan sat on the edge of his bed, the journal's twin open on his lap. His eyes flickered up to me, dazed, unfocused. On the nightstand beside him, a bottle of pills lay open, several already missing. I moved fast, crossing the room before I even thought about it. Jonathan, I said, shaking his shoulder. Stay with me. His lips parted, but no words came out. His breaths were slow, too slow. I grabbed the bottle, scanning the label. Sleeping pills. A dangerous amount. I cursed under my breath. Come on, man, you're not doing this. His eyes met mine, and for the first time, they weren't empty. They were filled with something raw, something broken. I just wanted to see her again, he whispered. I clenched my jaw. Not like this. I grabbed my phone, dialing emergency services with one hand while shaking him with the other. He didn't fight me. He just let me hold him up like he was too tired to resist. The sirens were faint at first, then louder. Jonathan's head rested against my shoulder, his body weak but alive. And for the first time that night, I let out a breath. I knew what I had just read. I knew exactly what it meant. Tomorrow it ends. There's nothing left for me. Jonathan wasn't planning on seeing another sunrise. The thought sent a jolt through me. I'd driven all kinds of people over the years. Rich, poor, broken, lost. Some were running from something, others chasing something they'd never catch. But I had never left someone behind knowing they might not make it through the night. I couldn't just drive away. I slammed the car into gear, my pulse hammering as I sped back to that rundown apartment. The rain blurred the windshield, the tires splashing through puddles, but I didn't slow down. My gut told me I didn't have time to. When I pulled up, the street was empty, silent except for the rain tapping against metal and concrete. The building looked even worse now, darkened windows, graffiti crawling up the walls like veins. I jumped out, barely registering the cold as I rushed to the entrance. The buzzer was useless, just like before. I pounded on the door, hard enough to rattle the rusted metal frame. Nothing. I tried again. Jonathan. My voice echoed down the empty hallway. Still nothing. I reached for the handle and felt it shift. The door wasn't locked. A bad sign. I pushed it open slowly, stepping inside. The air smelled stale, thick with something I couldn't place. A single lamp cast a dim glow, flickering weakly in the corner. The apartment was small, barely enough space to move. Clothes were piled on a chair, papers scattered across the floor. Then I saw him. Jonathan was sitting in a chair by the window, his head bowed, his hands limp at his sides. A small table next to him held empty pill bottles. For a second, my chest clenched. I thought I was too late. I rushed forward, dropping to my knees beside him. My hands shook as I grabbed his shoulder, giving him a firm shake. "Hey, stay with me." No response. I shook him harder. "Come on, Jonathan, don't do this." A slow breath. A slight twitch of his fingers. He was still there. His eyelids fluttered, and after what felt like forever, his tired, sunken eyes met mine. His pupils were unfocused, his face pale, but he was awake. "Why do you care?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. I exhaled sharply, relief and frustration mixing into something I couldn't name. "Because you got in my cab," I said, forcing my voice to stay steady. "Because I read your damn journal. Because you don't get to just disappear like this." He blinked slowly, like he was trying to process my words through a fog. "You don't even know me," he murmured. "Doesn't mean I'm gonna sit back and let you die," I snapped. "So, what happens now? You just check out and let the world forget you?" His lips trembled. "The world already has." "Bullshit." Jonathan's breath hitched, but he didn't say anything. I sat back on my heels, running a hand over my damp face. "Look, man, I've seen people give up before. I've seen people with nothing still find a reason to wake up. So tell me what the hell happened. Who was she?" At first, I thought he wouldn't answer. But then, his gaze flickered to the journal still in my hands. "She was everything," he whispered. His voice cracked, and his fingers twitched like he wanted to take the book from me but didn't have the strength. I placed it gently in his lap. Jonathan traced the worn leather with shaking hands. "Her name was Eleanor. We met in 1968. I was 20, she was 18. He let out a shaky breath. "Her father didn't approve. She was white. I wasn't." I swallowed hard. "We ran away together," he continued, his voice distant, lost in memories. "Didn't matter where. Just somewhere we could be us. Back then, people didn't like seeing a black man with a white woman. Didn't matter that we loved each other. I didn't need him to explain. I already knew. She got pregnant," he said softly. "We were happy. Terrified but happy. We were gonna start a new life. But then," his breath shuddered. "She got sick. Complications. The doctors," he let out a humorless chuckle, his face twisting with something bitter. "They didn't care. Said they had other priorities." I clenched my fists. "She died." He swallowed hard, blinking rapidly. "And the baby, our baby, never made it." Silence filled the room, heavier than the storm outside. I didn't know what to say. What could I say? I'd never lost someone like that. Never had to fight just to love someone, only to have the world take it away anyway. Jonathan sucked in a shaky breath. I tried to move on. Found work. Built a life. But it never felt real. Without her, it was just waiting. He stared at the journal. "And now, after all these years, I don't have anything left to wait for." His fingers tightened around the book, like it was the only thing keeping him from shattering completely. I looked around the room again. The peeling walls, the damp air, the papers scattered everywhere. A life that had shrunk down to one chair, one window, one final decision. "Jonathan," I said, my voice quieter now. "I get it. I do." He let out a dry laugh. "No, you don't." I leaned forward. "You think you're the only one who's been stepped on?" You think you're the only one this city tried to break. I shook my head. You don't know me either, old man. You don't know what it's like to drive around a city that looks at you like you don't belong. To work twice as hard for half as much. To raise a kid alone and wonder if you're ever gonna make it out? Jonathan looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time. My daughter, I said, swallowing past the lump in my throat. She's 9. I work all night, barely see her, but I do it because she needs me. Because even when I'm too damn tired to keep going, I don't get the choice to stop. His expression softened, the ice in his eyes cracking just a little. I gestured at the journal. Eleanor wouldn't want this. You think she spent her life loving you just for you to give up now? His hands trembled. I don't know how to keep going, he whispered. I exhaled. You don't have to figure it all out tonight. But you gotta take the next step. Just one. He stared down at the journal, his breath uneven. For the first time, he didn't look like a man at the end of his rope. He just looked lost. I reached into my jacket and pulled out my phone. I'm calling an ambulance. Jonathan didn't argue. Didn't fight me. When the sirens finally came, lighting up the dark street, he let them take his hand. And as I stepped back into the rain, watching the ambulance pull away, I realized something. Tonight, I had saved someone. Maybe tomorrow, someone would save me. Jonathan sat there, slumped in the chair, his breath uneven. His fingers trembled as they clutched the journal in his lap, the leather soaked with the sweat from his palms. The empty pill bottles on the table told me how close he had come. The weight of his pain filled the room, thick like the dampness in the walls. I knelt beside him, feeling the ache in my knees, but I didn't move. For the first time, I wasn't just another driver picking up another lost soul. I wasn't just some faceless cabbie, invisible to the world. Right now, I was the only thing standing between this man and the abyss. I get it, I said, my voice low. Jonathan's tired eyes flicked to me, hollow and empty, like he was already halfway gone. You don't, he murmured, shaking his head. I let out a breath, rubbing a hand over my face. The rain outside tapped against the window, steady, relentless. It had been falling since the night started, and now, sitting in this room, it felt like it might never stop. You're wrong, I said. You think I don't know what it's like to lose someone? To wake up every day and feel like you're carrying something too heavy, something that's never gonna let you stand up straight again? He didn't answer, but he didn't look away either. My wife, I said, swallowing against the tightness in my throat. She was my Eleanor. Maybe not in the same way, maybe not with the same battles, but she was everything. And then one night she was just gone. Car accident. Wrong place, wrong time. Jonathan's lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. Lily was 4, I continued. 4 years old. I had to tell her that mommy wasn't coming home. I had to hold her while she cried, and then I had to figure out how to keep going, even when I didn't want to. My voice cracked and I exhaled sharply. You know how many nights I sat in my car after a shift, staring at nothing, wondering if I should just disappear? If it would be easier for her if I wasn't around, if someone else, someone better, could raise her? Jonathan's breath hitched. His fingers twitched, tightening around the edges of the journal. I don't have all the answers, I admitted. Hell, most days I'm just getting by, one shift at a time. But I know this, you don't have to do this. There's always another way. Jonathan sucked in a shaky breath, his whole body trembling. Then, as if something inside him cracked wide open, he broke down. The sobs tore out of him, rough, ragged. He let go of the journal and grabbed my arm instead, holding on like he was afraid to let go. His fingers dug into my sleeve, his frail body shaking as years, decades, of pain poured out of him. I didn't move. I just let him hold on. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The room was filled with the sound of his crying, the sound of the rain, the quiet hum of the city outside. Then, as his sobs finally began to subside, I saw something on the last page of the journal. A name. A number. Sophia. I frowned, glancing at Jonathan. His head was still bowed, his breath coming in unsteady gasps. Who's Sophia? I asked. He stiffened. His fingers loosened slightly from my sleeve, but he didn't pull away. She. His voice faltered. He swallowed hard. She's my granddaughter. A chill ran through me. You have family? I asked, trying to keep the anger out of my voice. Jonathan nodded, almost reluctantly. I clenched my jaw. And you were just gonna leave her? Just disappear without a word? He exhaled sharply. She doesn't know me. We lost touch years ago. I don't. He hesitated, rubbing a hand over his face. I don't think she cares. I grabbed the journal and held it up. She wrote her number in here. That doesn't look like someone who doesn't care. Jonathan's shoulders sagged. I wouldn't know what to say. I pulled out my phone. Then let's find out. His eyes widened. What are you doing? I ignored him, punching in the number. Tring. Twice. Then a voice. Hello. A woman. I hesitated for a second, then spoke. Is this Sophia? Yes. Who's this? I glanced at Jonathan. His hands were shaking again, but this time, it wasn't from exhaustion. It was fear. My name's Ethan, I said. I'm here with your grandfather. Silence. For a second, I thought she had hung up. Then her breath hitched. My grandfather? Jonathan? Yeah, I said. I found his journal. Saw your number. I hesitated. I think he needs you. Another pause. Then, her voice came back, stronger this time. Where is he? I gave her the address. Jonathan's hands were clenched into fists, his whole body tense. Why did you do that? He asked quietly. Because I don't believe for a second that you don't matter to someone, I said. And I'm not letting you die thinking you do. He let out a long, shaky breath. He didn't say anything else. Minutes passed. The rain continued. Then footsteps. A knock at the door. Jonathan flinched. His breath caught in his throat. I stood up, moving to the door. When I opened it, a woman stood there. Mid-30s, dark curls clinging to her face from the rain. Her eyes, wide and filled with something raw, flickered past me and landed on the man sitting in the chair. Grandpa, she whispered. Jonathan's whole body trembled. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Sophia stepped forward, eyes shining. I thought you were gone, she choked out. Jonathan finally moved. His lips parted. Sophia? She didn't wait. She crossed the room in seconds, dropping to her knees in front of him, just like I had. He reached out slowly, hesitantly, as if afraid she'd disappear. But she didn't. Her hands covered his. And just like that, Jonathan wasn't alone anymore. I stepped back, letting them have their moment. I grabbed my keys, the journal still on the table, and turned toward the door. Ethan, Jonathan called softly. I glanced back. Tears streaked his face, but for the first time, there was something else there. Something fragile, something like hope. Thank you, he said. I nodded. Take care of yourself, old man. I stepped out into the rain, the door closing behind me. The night was still dark. The city was still cruel. But for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel so damn tired. Maybe, just maybe, there was still something left to believe in. The next morning, I was running on fumes. After dropping Jonathan at the hospital and making sure he wasn't alone, I barely had the energy to drag myself home. By the time I got there, Lily was already awake, sitting on the couch with her stuffed rabbit, her eyes lighting up the second I walked through the door. Daddy! She ran over and wrapped her arms around me. You're home. I held her tight, closing my eyes for a second. I had missed bedtime again. Missed another story, another chance to be the father she deserved. Sorry, baby, I murmured. Daddy had a long night. She pulled back, her nose scrunching. You smell like rain. I chuckled, ruffling her hair. Yeah, it was a wet night. Before I could say anything else, my phone rang. An unfamiliar number. I hesitated, then answered. Hello. A woman's voice, unsteady. Is this Ethan? Yeah, I said, straightening. Who's this? I'm Sophia. I blinked. Jonathan's granddaughter? A sharp inhale. Oh. His daughter. I sat down, suddenly wide awake. He called me, she whispered. This morning. We haven't spoken in years. And he said you saved his life. I let out a slow breath. He told me everything, she continued, her voice breaking. I thought he didn't care anymore. That he had just disappeared. I wasn't sure what to say. My brother Daniel and you were going to see him. I just wanted you to know. That's good, I said quietly. There was a pause and then, Ethan? Yeah. Thank you. I swallowed. Just take care of him, all right? I could hear the tears in her voice when she said, we will. I hung up and sat there for a long time, staring at my phone. I don't know why I went back to the hospital. Maybe I just wanted to see for myself that it was real, that I hadn't just imagined it all. When I got there, I stopped outside Jonathan's room, peering in through the small window. He was awake, sitting up in bed, his thin frame propped up by pillows. He looked different, less like a man waiting to disappear. Then the door opened and they walked in. Sophia and Daniel. Jonathan's face crumbled the second he saw them. I thought I lost you both forever, he whispered. Sophia didn't hesitate. She crossed the room and wrapped her arms around him, holding on tight. We just needed you to reach out, Dad. Jonathan clung to her like he was afraid she'd vanish if he let go. Daniel, standing beside them, reached out and squeezed his father's shoulder. He didn't say anything, but the look in his eyes said enough. I stepped back, letting them have their moment. I didn't belong here. This was their story now. I turned to leave, but Jonathan's voice stopped me. Ethan. I turned, and for the first time, I saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. You didn't just save my life, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You gave me a reason to fight for it. Days later, I got a call from Jonathan. He wanted to meet. Said it was important. I found him sitting on a park bench, the same place he had probably spent years alone, watching the world move without him. But this time, he wasn't alone. Sophia and Daniel sat beside him, talking, laughing. The family whole again. When I approached, Jonathan stood, his movements slow but steady. You're a stubborn man, Ethan, he said, smiling. And I owe you more than I can ever repay. You don't owe me anything, old man, I said. That's where you're wrong. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, pressing it into my palm. I looked down. A set of house keys. I frowned. Jonathan, what? This belonged to my family, he said softly. But a house without people in it isn't a home. I don't need a house. I need my family. I stared at him. And you, he continued, you need a fresh start? I shook my head. Jonathan, I can't. You can, he insisted. You gave me back my family. Let me give you a home. I opened my mouth to argue, but the words wouldn't come. Take it, he said. For Lily. For yourself. I closed my fingers around the keys, my throat tight. I had spent years clawing for something better, for some kind of stability, and now, here it was. I swallowed hard. I don't know what to say. Jonathan smiled. Then don't say anything. Just accept it. A week later, I stood in front of the house. It wasn't much, an old place, a little rundown, with peeling paint and a front porch that had seen better days. But it was ours. Lily stood beside me, her eyes wide. Is this really ours? She asked, her small fingers tightening around mine. I looked down at her and smiled, ruffling her hair. Yeah, kiddo. It's ours. As we stepped inside, the smell of old wood and dust greeted us, but it wasn't empty. There were boxes, supplies, furniture, things to help us settle in. And in the middle of it all stood Jonathan, Sophia, and Daniel. You didn't think we'd let you move in alone, did you? Sophia said, grinning. I exhaled, shaking my head. Jonathan stepped forward, his eyes shining. Welcome home, Ethan. I swallowed against the lump in my throat. We spent the rest of the day unpacking, cleaning, filling the house with something it had probably been missing for years. Laughter, life, family. That evening, we all sat around the small dining table, plates filled, voices overlapping in conversation. For the first time in years, I felt something I had almost forgotten. Jonathan raised his glass, his voice steady. To second chances. I looked around the table, at the people who had once been strangers, at Lily, who smiled brighter than I had seen in a long time. I lifted my glass. To second chances.